Hello, boys and girls. Today we're going to be talking about how do we learn about the past. Let's take a moment and think. What are some ways that we can learn about the past? So, at the time of my grandma, a big fight happened. But I wasn't even born. Hmm. So, how can I ever know about what happened? What are some ways that we can learn about the past? Well, did you think of any? There are many ways to learn about the past. What are some ways? What do you think? Well, we can learn about the past by listening to people tell stories about the past. An example can be listening to our grandparents or our parents telling us stories of the past. Another way to learn about the past is by reading historical documents. An example would be the biography of Helen Keller. Is this a historical document? If you answered yes, you're absolutely right. What is another way? What do you think? Excellent. You can also learn about the past from photographs that show how people and places looked before and objects that show things people used. For example, pictures of people in the past showing their old traditional clothes or driving old cars. Also, pictures of Lebanon from the past. It shows the old buildings, what they look like, and the places compared to today. Now, did you know that all the different ways we learn about the past are called sources? And they are divided into primary sources and secondary sources. Now we're going to go and learn a little bit more about them. Now, let's take a look at what a primary source is. A primary source tells you about an event and is from the time of that event. For example, if my grandma lived at the time of the event, so if she tells me about what happened or shows me pictures or books from that time, these are called primary sources. Did you understand? Now let's look at some examples. Now, what are some examples of primary sources? Can you think of any? Now remember that a primary source is written or made by a person who was at that event. An example of these are documents and photographs that were taken at the time of the event are primary sources. These documents or pictures tells us about people, places, and events that happened in the past. Now another example of a primary source is a recorded interview with that person who experienced that event. For example, you have a recorded interview with Martin Luther King. It's him talking in the past, and they're interviewing him, asking him questions about what he's doing and what he believes in. This is a primary source. Now, what are some other examples of primary sources? So a map can also be a primary source because it can show you what a place looked like in the past. A letter written in the past can also be a primary source because we can learn about the past by reading it. Now remember that the letter was written in the past, so even if you have a photocopy of that letter, it is still considered a primary source as well. Now, can you think of other primary sources? Other examples of primary sources are newspaper articles from the past, government records, autobiographies, which means that it's a book that tells the life story of a person told by that person, any art objects from the past or artifacts, or any videos taken in the past. So now you learned what a primary source is and some examples of it. So let's take a few moments to think what a secondary source is. What do you think? Other examples of primary sources are newspaper articles from the past, also government records or autobiographies, which means that it's the life story of a person told by that person, or any art objects from the past, or any videos taken in the past. Now let's take a few moments to think. Now, did you get a chance to come up with what secondary sources are? Well, a secondary source tells you about people, places, and events from the past, but it is written or made after the event happened by someone who has not experienced the event him or herself, meaning that person or someone was not there. Now, an example of its secondary source are your school books, your history school books, or your library books, because they are telling you about events that happened in the past, but they were never there. So they are writing what they learned from other people. Now, let's look at how the primary and secondary sources work together. What do you think? Well, for example, I have to write a report about what happened in Lebanon before its independence in 1943. But I wasn't born then, so how can I find out? Oh, I can ask my grandmother, because she lived in Lebanon during that time. She is a primary source because she lived in Lebanon during that time and she experienced the Lebanese independence. Now, I would be a secondary source because I am writing about what happened from what my grandmother told me. So I did not live during the event or was there during the event. So that makes me a secondary source. Now, can you think of other examples of secondary sources? Did you think of any? Well, other examples of secondary sources are history books, like I told you, encyclopedias, documentaries, which are movies about people or events told by other people that didn't live through the event, biographies, which are books about the life of one person told by another person. For example, if I want to write a book about Albert Einstein, so I would be writing about his life. So I'm writing about somebody else. Also, articles or websites on Google, school history books, or library books. All these are examples of secondary sources. Now, boys and girls, what I'm going to tell you is very important because there are many sources that you can look through in order to learn about the past. But how do we know if what a source says it's reliable or is it true? What do you think? Well, you can ask questions about the source. For example, where did the information come from? Do you recognize the publishing company? Or who wrote the source? Is it a well-known author? Do we know who he is? How we heard about him? When was the source made? Or what was the source made for? Why was it made? Was it made for a history class in school, or maybe for an article in the newspaper? Is there another way? Yes, of course. You can also read many sources. Then you can see if the facts are the same. Remember, good sources give the same facts. So if you're looking at two different books, if it's a good sources, both of them, they should be telling you almost the same information. Now, I hope you learned the different ways to learn about the past with primary and secondary sources, and how also we can make sure a source is reliable. Now, boys and girls, to see if you understood what a primary source or a secondary source is, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Are you ready? First one. If you find a letter that your grandfather wrote to your grandmother a very, very long time ago in 1943, that means it was the time that Lebanon became independent. In the letter, Your grandfather tells all the events that happened during 1943. Is this letter a primary source or a secondary source? Think really hard. Now, my second question is, if your teacher gives you a history book and it's titled The History of Lebanon During Its Independence, this is a new book and it was just written, brand new. Is it a primary source or is it a secondary source? Think hard and reflect. It's new. What do you think? And my last question. When you grow up, for example, in 20 years from now, you will all be 27 or 28 years old. Probably somebody will come and ask you, do you remember the time of the coronavirus when we were all at home and we didn't have the right to go out? Now, listen to the question carefully. Are you considered a primary source or a secondary source? Think hard.